Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so good news. I'm not going to be doing most of this teaching today. So you'll actually hear from somebody that actually is capable of teaching. Well, I just wanted to start out with just like go to the first slide if you don't care. I just want to start out with just a quick overview of what we did last week and just kind of go back over. Can you move it forward one? There we go. All right. So last week we talked about how archaeology and how science and archaeology point toward the Bible being true. It's just how you interpret the data that's there. The scientific world interprets the data in a way that they say it's billions and millions of years old, and we interpret the data by the Bible. And really and truly, both of these people would be in agreement if the scientific community acknowledged a global flood. With a global flood, there's no argument. Yeah. When we believe in it and they don't. So today what we're doing is we're going to show how non-biblical sources point toward the Bible being true, especially Jesus in the early church. That's what I'm really focusing on today. Quite frankly, there's not a ton of, when you start thinking about in the time of Jesus, there's not a ton of original documents that are left. But there are a lot about the Bible that is still out there that is from the time period that would have been in living memory of people that could have refuted it. So I think it's important that we use these non-biblical sources just as verification. I think they do that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, we're going to watch this movie and then we're going to talk about it when we get done. It's about 29 minutes long, but he does an excellent job, and I can't do better than what he did, I guarantee it. It's Matt Whitman is the guy that we're going to be listening to. I do not agree with everything that Matt says all the time. I don't agree with everything that John MacArthur says all the time. There's nobody that I agree with 100%. I do agree with everything that he says in this video, except for the one thing. The one thing that I don't agree with is I do believe the victors write history. I think that history shows us that the victors write history, and at the very end of this, he's going to say the victors don't write history, and we'll talk about that when we get done. But that's the only thing in this entire video that, and I've watched it a dozen times, that I don't agree with. So I thought about trying to get a bunch of the information that he's got in this out of it, and I said, wait a minute, I'm reinventing the wheel. I cannot do better than what he did in the time period that he did it. So we're going to watch that. I wanted to explain this handout. This handout is so you don't have to try to, like we talked about last week, do your own research. This is a starting point for where you can get your research. He's going to talk, the people at the top are non-Christian extra-biblical sources that he references in this. All this stuff's available on the internet. You can go look at you can go look these people up and look these quotes up for yourself that he's going to tell you. And then below, these are the things that these non-extra-biblical sources verify. This is evidence that Jesus in the early church existed. And you can see the Bible sources that kind of point toward that we believe out of. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, I do want to do this next slide. Yep. So y'all read my disclaimer. Carrie did that. All right, play our video.
Today I'd like to start with an exercise. No, not like sit-ups or push-ups. I mean a mental exercise. I want you to think of someone who lived before 500 AD who isn't in the Bible. Ready? Go. Time's up. Did you come up with Julius Caesar? Today I'd like to start with an exercise. No, not like sit-ups or push-ups. I mean a mental exercise. I want you to think of someone who lived before 500 AD who isn't in the Bible. Ready? Go. Time's up. Did you come up with Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, or Socrates? Well, if you did come up with one of those three, then you're a lot like the three people I talked to in a scientific poll I conducted in preparation for this presentation. Obviously, everybody knows that those three guys existed and did a bunch of important stuff. But have you ever wondered how we actually know that? Well, the short answer is historians have gathered a whole bunch of evidence over the years, written manuscripts, artifacts, artwork, looked at the legacy of things that happened and figured out whether that made sense with the accounts of these guys that we have written down, and said basically there's a preponderance of evidence that states these guys existed and they did the following things. But if what you want is singular primary source, original stuff, smoking gun stuff, written at the exact time that they were doing things, we don't have much. So real quick, here are our classical sources on Julius Caesar. Number 1, a contemporary named Cicero wrote letters that talked about Caesar. Number 2, a guy named Plutarch wrote some stuff about Caesar in 100 AD, roughly 150 years after he lived. Third, there was a guy named Suetonius who wrote at about the same time, and Caesar came up in what he had to say as well. Fourth, fifth, sixth, a guy named Appian, Dio Cassius, and Nicholas of Damascus all wrote about Caesar, again in that 200 to 300 year range after he lived. Beyond that, we can confirm that there was a guy named Caesar based on the fact that there's a famous sculpture of him that got copied and copied and copied and copied, and based on the fact that he coined money. But mostly, do you know how we know what we know about Caesar? It's from stuff Caesar wrote. Caesar told us about Caesar. He was a prolific author. He wrote about his military exploits in Europe, and we still have all of that stuff. So we know a lot of stuff about Caesar from outside sources a long time after the fact, but we know a ton about Caesar because of what Caesar said about himself. Well, Caesar lived from about 100 BC to 44 BC. But if we want to talk about Alexander, we have to go even further back. He lived from 356 to 323 BC, and we have no contemporary accounts that survive of any kind of first-hand description of what was going on. Rather, historians depend on roughly third-hand accounts that came up 300 or 400 years after the fact. That doesn't mean we don't know anything about him, though. We know a ton about him, and all of those different sources roughly line up and give us a pretty clear picture of what his life was like. Both of these guys were conquerors, so there's a whole bunch of external political and historical realities that also match up with the written accounts that let us know they probably did this stuff the way it was described. Socrates is a little bit of a different deal, though. He lived a generation before Aristotle. He's regarded as one of the great thinkers in the history of the Western tradition, but he didn't write anything down, and nobody at least immediately recorded exactly what he was saying. We have stuff that Plato, his student, wrote down that gives an account or an idea of what Socrates was about, and we have some other external accounts that are just way after the fact. We have no architecture, no relics, no coins, no conquest, and the earliest copies we have of stuff written about Socrates post-date him by hundreds and hundreds of years. My point is that if you really go and look about how we know what we know about these super famous people, there isn't a ton, but it's quite a lot to have surviving for 2,000 or 2,500 years, and it all lines up with each other and with logic, so we take it for what it is. But what about Jesus in the early church? I mean, if some guy showed up, taught all the stuff that he taught, made the social waves that he made, performed public signs and wonders all over the place that everybody saw, then got executed by the state, then 3 days later came back from the dead, then showed up in front of a whole bunch of people and had meals with them and hung out with them until he eventually ascended into the sky, witnessed by people who were in agreement that that happened. And then a little bit after that, the Holy Spirit shows up, and all of a sudden Jesus' followers can speak languages they don't speak, and then they start healing people, and dead people are coming back to life, and this church goes from a group of about 120 people to a group of thousands and thousands and thousands of people that eventually becomes such a big deal that Rome decides it needs to try to suppress this movement, and eventually they realize they can't suppress the movement, and people in leadership come to participate in the movement, and at that point, Christianity becomes the dominant, even official religion of the Roman state. That's a really big shift in history. You would think that if all that stuff happened, there'd be some kind of documentation. Recently in my travels on the internets, I've come across some remarks or comments or articles that try to argue that there was no external corroboration of the events described in the New Testament. And that's just not accurate. It's not like an opinion question where one could see it this way and one could see it that way, any more than whether or not there was a Julius Caesar is an opinion question that one could see this way and one could see that way. We're talking about something that was documented and cross-referenced, and unlike Julius Caesar, who was the conqueror and had control over the information and would have been interested in suppressing information that made him look bad, the church had no power. Jesus had no political power. And yet still, this movement was so significant, even from a position of relative social and political weakness, that these accounts still cropped up in the first century and managed to survive for the 2,000 years that have elapsed since. What I want to do today is take a look at that evidence and give you kind of an introduction to what some of that stuff is, where to find it, and how to read it. I've sat through a history class or two, so I know how easy it is to nod off and start to get incredibly bored by that type of content right off the bat. I'm telling you, this stuff is pretty interesting, and I hope you'll give it a look with me. But to help you better appreciate how big a deal it is that any sources continue to exist that confirm Jesus and the early church, I first want to talk about some of the challenges that you have to overcome when we try to look for this kind of source material. First, whether you're talking about Jesus, the church, or anything else, virtually no original material still exists from this point in history. You can get the impression watching shows like Indiana Jones that there are these huge temples just sitting around out there that nobody really noticed, or these giant treasure troves that it just never crossed anyone's mind to explore, that are filled with all of the secret history of the classical world and mankind in general. Maybe somewhere there's somebody sitting on such a trove, but probably not just in an undiscovered, pristine archaeological sense. So not a lot of sources and evidence exists from this era in history because it's all kind of been used up or grabbed along the way. But second, because stuff breaks. Think about stuff that you still have from your childhood. How's it holding up? Not great, I bet. Think about some heirlooms that you maybe still have from your grandparents' childhood. I bet that's really dinged up. Now think about the oldest book that you own. Even that is starting to look really ratty and is falling apart, I'll bet. Now imagine that book were to age another, say, 1900 years. What kind of condition do you think it would be in? Stuff breaks. Paper falls apart. This is the nature of things. So if you have a surviving copy of a manuscript from the first century, it's a pretty safe bet that there were hundreds more where that came from that didn't survive the trip through time. Another reason that it's difficult to find external corroboration from the Bible that dates back to the first few centuries AD is that early Christians would have felt like that was already done. Well, we've got 4 accounts of Jesus and they all line up. That's pretty good. They're all in circulation. We've got this one mega document of Acts that describes the early church. We've got these letters floating around that the apostles wrote. Those all account for the same stuff. They did history in a way that made sense for how people did history at their time. What they did checked out as legit history in their immediate context. So again, the early church would have felt like they had done a magnificent job of documenting what happened. Okay, you've been very patient with all of the theoretical stuff. Let's get on to some specifics. What I'm going to look at now are excerpts from authors from the first century around the time of Christ who mentioned stuff about Jesus and the early church. I think you'll find this fascinating. Okay, number 1, a guy named Tacitus. He was an historian who wrote around 100 AD. Here's something he had to say. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. With each of these accounts that I'm going to read to you, I'm going to point out what things we can glean about the story of Jesus in the early church. In this, we see that Jesus was executed, that happened during the reign of Tiberius. We see that Christianity found its origins in Judea, and that it was significant enough to be pushed back upon during the reign of Nero, which was in the 60s AD. Number 2, a guy named Lucian, a mid-1st century Greek author, said this: "The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage, who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they're all brothers. From the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. Okay, there's a ton there that sounds a whole lot like what we're seeing in Luke and Acts. Christians worship Jesus as God. They believe in eternal life. They're brave in the face of persecution. They count themselves as brothers and sisters. They only worship one God. Jesus was crucified, and they held their property in common, apparently meeting the needs of the poor. Those are 7 details that provide, in and of themselves, a pretty solid framework for what this whole story is about. But there's a lot more. A third author, Suetonius, who I mentioned earlier, wrote around 100 AD. He was a biographer of Claudius. He was a Roman, and it's a brief mention, but he says this: "As the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled them from Rome." Presumably, this Chrestus is Christ, but it certainly matches up with the timeline and indicates a brief Claudian persecution because he misunderstood the relationship between Christianity and the Jews. Fourth, a guy named Thallus. Thallus apparently wrote in the mid-1st century, but we don't have any actual copies of his manuscripts. Instead, we can figure out that he wrote a book because a whole bunch of other people quote him in their works that do still exist. Thallus was interested in the natural world and observed a strange phenomenon that he recorded. Here's a quote of Thallus from the 1st century AD. "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." So later authors recorded this guy having said, there was a weird earthquake and an unpredicted eclipse that shouldn't have happened at the time that it happened. Obviously, all of this stuff lines up with the account of the crucifixion and some of the natural phenomena that occurred at that moment. But wait, there's more. Number 5, a guy named Pliny. Sometimes you'll hear it said Pliny. I don't know, whichever. Say whatever you want. The guy who I'm going to call Pliny was a representative of the emperor who worked in modern-day Turkey. And one of his tasks was to get to the bottom of what the deal was with this Christian religion and to execute a persecution that was to be carried out against them. He wrote back to the Emperor Trajan the following report. "They, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind." He goes on in another letter. "I asked them directly if they were Christians. Those who persisted I ordered away. Those who denied they were or ever had been Christians worshipped both your image and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. They used to gather on a stated day before dawn and sing to Christ as if he were a god. All the more I believed it necessary to find out what was the truth from 2 servant maids which were called deaconesses by means of torture. Nothing more did I find than a disgusting fanatical superstition. Therefore I stopped the examination and hastened to consult you on account of the number of people endangered. For many of all ages, all classes, and both sexes already are brought into danger." There's a ton going on here, and this is coming from a hostile source, but you got to admit the Christians come off looking pretty dang good in this account. From Pliny's correspondence with Trajan, we can deduce then that Christians met weekly, that they sang songs about God, that they viewed Jesus as God, that they had a code of Christian morality based on the teachings of Christ, that they met each other's needs, that they were evangelistic, and that they were persecuted by Rome. So there's 7 more things that give us a sense of what the church looks like, and if you've been with me on this Acts thing, that sounds just like what we're seeing in Luke's account. A 6th source is the Talmud, a Jewish document probably written around the 3rd century AD. Obviously, this would not be a flattering account of the history of Jesus, but it's an account nonetheless. It goes like this. "On the eve of the Passover, Yeshua, Jesus, was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, 'He's going forth to be stoned because he's practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say nothing in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf.' But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover." Stuff we can glean from this. Jesus was crucified, he did miracles, people followed him, and his support momentarily waned during his trial and execution. 7th, here's another Jewish source, a guy named Mara bar Serapion, who was writing after the destruction of the temple, so just after 70 AD. This guy's account might be considered favorable toward Christianity, so you can decide for yourself whether this counts as a extra biblical non-Christian source once you've heard it for yourself. What he had to say goes like this. "What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was after that that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates didn't die for good. He lived on in the teachings of Plato. Pythagoras didn't die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he'd given. Regardless of whether or not you agree with his position, we can still gather historically that Jesus was regarded as a wise teacher, that people followed him, and that he was crucified at the behest of the Jews. Eighth, a guy named Celsus, who was a harsh Roman critic of Christianity who wrote in the mid-100s. He said the following: Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them, gave himself out to be a god. It was by these means of sorcery that he was able to accomplish the wonders which he performed. Let us believe that these cures, or the resurrection, or the feeding of a multitude with a few loaves, these are nothing more than the tricks of jugglers. It is by the names of certain demons and by the use of incantations that the Christians appear to be possessed of miraculous power. Celsus's attacks on Christianity were so aggressive that they drew responses from key early church leaders like Origen. Even though what Celsus wrote was obviously biting and fully condemning of Christianity and anybody who would believe that stuff, still the fact that he wrote it, that it was a big enough deal to be responded to, and in the details he wrote down, we get further external corroboration of some of the details of Jesus in the early church. We can gather that Jesus went to Egypt, that he had power, that he proclaimed deity, that he specifically raised from the dead, that he specifically healed, that he specifically fed a multitude, and implicitly we can gather that the church mattered enough by this point for Celsus to throw his energy into this criticism. Ninth, a guy named Josephus also wrote about this stuff. He's maybe the most famous first century historian out of the Jewish ranks. He was a Jew who fought on the side of the Jews when they rebelled against Rome, but then when he realized that Rome was definitely going to win, he flipped sides and eventually became a Roman historian. He wrote great big volumes that tell us all kinds of things about the early age of the emperors in the 1st century AD, and not surprisingly, Jesus does come up in what he writes. But what Josephus had to say is contested. I am of the opinion that some of Josephus's famous quote about Jesus, that I'll read to you in a second, is a later addition by an eager Christian. But I'll let you hear it anyway. Here's how it sounds. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. It doesn't make sense to me that Josephus, who never converted to Christianity as best as we can tell, would have written in such favorable and even theologically accurate terms about the nature of Jesus in a history that was meant to be read by Romans. Additionally, the earliest manuscripts of Josephus don't include this stuff. It only shows up later on. But that doesn't mean the thing is a hoax or not useful to us. So let's just say that that was a later edition and take the version Josephus most likely wrote without any of those additions and see if it's useful on its own merit. Listen to this. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him, and the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. See, that's still pretty solid. There's a ton there for us to glean. Now, Josephus goes on and he also talks about John the Baptist and the trial and I think execution of James, brother of Jesus, later on. But for the sake of time, we'll skip over those. If we agree only to accept the less Christian version of Josephus's account, we still get a whole bunch of things from this that provide external corroboration, including Jesus lived, he was wise, he had followers, he did wonders. That following went beyond the Jews to the Gentiles or the Greeks. Pilate was in charge of his trial. He was crucified. The movement immediately persisted and still existed at the time that Josephus wrote this in the 80s or 90s AD. So for the time being, I've turned out 9 highly compelling secular sources that fall within the first 100 years of the life of Christ. But in addition to that, there are tons of extra-biblical Christian sources that some people just say, that doesn't count, they were Christians. Well, I think they do count in the same way that Julius Caesar writing about himself counts for giving us insight as to what went on in the story of Julius Caesar. It's not like all these extra-biblical Christian writings were just fabricated. They indicate a pattern of belief that people all over the Mediterranean world, where they weren't calling each other on the phone or connecting on the internet, all these people all had the same take on what happened. And all the things they wrote still had to pass muster under the review of a living memory audience. I'm not going to read excerpts from all of these extra-biblical early Christian sources, but I am going to run down some of the details so that you can look them up for yourself if you would like later on. Clement of Rome wrote letters to the Corinthian church, among other things, and essentially confirms Luke's account in Acts across the board of how the church developed. Ignatius of Antioch died around 100 AD. He wrote from about 70 AD until the end of his life, and in that writing he confirmed a lot of the political details of Jesus' execution, as well as the religious details of his teaching, as well as the practical details of his life and the wonders he performed. He also gave accounts of the early church that line up neatly with the book of Acts. We also get the same kind of accounts from Quadratus, Aristides, and Justin Martyr. There's a ton of rich detail there, and you can look all of that up on your own time if you would like. So here's the thing. If you go back through and think about all the things that we have externally confirmed from each of these sources that I mentioned and listed out, it's like most of the New Testament. It's really well covered outside the Bible. And it's far better coverage than most of the things we think we know about this same period in history that don't have to do with Jesus and Christianity. Look, I'm not naive. I get what's going on here. It doesn't cost anybody anything. It doesn't affect anything. It doesn't weigh in on any political or social arguments of the day to think one thing or another thing about the people of Athens or Sparta or what was going on in Carthage in 150 BC. I mean, it's all interesting, but it just doesn't have bearing on today. But this does. I think the harshest critics of the Bible really exaggerate the quality of their position and maybe even tiptoe close to intellectual dishonesty when they say things like, there's no proof Jesus ever existed, or, well, the things in the Bible are only written down in the Bible and there's no external corroboration. It just ain't true. I just gave you 9 of them. You can look them up for yourselves. And you can go through and nitpick and try to attack the quality of every one of these things. But I was pretty honest with you about those places where those critiques hold water and where they don't. It's just historians who wrote things down. They weren't even trying to prop up the church. These external historians, if anything, were trying to criticize the church. Well, some might say, if this is also true, then why isn't there more archaeological evidence? What would there be archaeological evidence of? Jesus didn't build any buildings. He didn't mint any coins. He didn't lead any armies. There are no wars. There are no spear tips. There are no mass graves. There's a guy who taught ideas and did miraculous good things in front of people. The evidence is found in reason and in eyewitness accounts and those people who sourced those eyewitness accounts to write their own secondhand accounts, like most stuff in history. For those who would say, well, Jesus might have been real, but everything about the church was just because kind of a legend grew up around him and then people followed that legendary version of Jesus. But we're talking about a few weeks between the time Jesus was alive and the time that the church really got going. Legends don't develop that fast. Can you think of any corollary in modern times where huge groups of people suddenly imagine someone who's still alive or was just alive a couple of weeks ago to have been imbued with magical powers? I mean, nobody thinks that. Legends take forever to evolve. They take tellings of retellings of retellings of retellings over years, decades, generations, centuries. This just doesn't follow that recipe at all. The fact of the matter is, the accounts in the Bible, the historical accounts we looked at today outside the Bible, and the Christian accounts from outside the Bible all hold themselves out to be historical. That's the genre they're writing in. Nothing about it indicates that it's a prank or a hoax, or that there was any power to be gained from having people accept the writings that they put down. All of that stuff that people think about the powerful church and the money and the armies, that is hundreds of years down the road. We're just not there yet at the point in history that we're looking at today. Look, what is irrefutable is that there is such a thing as Christianity and that there has been for 2,000 years. If Christianity has existed this long, it means we need to find a plausible explanation for where it came from. And since the origins of Christianity are not based in power or conquest, the most plausible explanation is the one that we actually have in front of us right now. It doesn't make sense to grasp at straws or try to pull things out of thin air to come up with something that makes more sense. This makes sense. Something miraculous happened. Sane, smart, capable people with brains like you and me, who are discerning like you and me, looked at it and said, I don't get it. It blows my mind, but I saw that with my eyes. All my buddies saw that thing too, and then we saw more stuff, and it adds up. And they gave their lives and they gave their stuff in dedication to that belief. That's the simplest, most logical explanation for what we see happening here. The simple reality is that all of these corroborating sources and the Bible line up neatly with what we see in history. All the locations that we see in the Bible line up neatly with archaeology and the geography from Roman times that we still have in front of us. All the places are in relation to all the other places as they should be and as they still are. The names line up, the dates line up. This looks like something that happened historically, and it looks like there aren't glaring historical errors in this account. Anymore, if you really boil it down, I think what people are really having an issue with is historical inquiry in general when they complain about the reliability of the Bible or these accounts. In the 21st century West, we're all pretty good at scientific inquiry, and we all understand those parameters. Without meaning any insult to you or to me, I just don't think it's quite as natural for us anymore to engage in non-scientific inquiry, to study the past. I think that we've kind of started to believe that everything that happened before right this moment is just totally a matter of opinion and interpretation. People lazily repeat things like history was written by the winners, when the fact is we have a whole lot of history that was written by the losers, like these people. They were not the winners at this point in history and wouldn't be for hundreds of years, long after their deaths. Historical research and inquiry is hard. It's a practice that we're not into. But if we take a few minutes like this to look at it together, we see that belief in the account regarding Jesus is not crazy. It's rooted in history, and there's a valid reason to think this. Now, last thought. I completely get that somebody could look at this same information, could read these same passages, and think to themselves, it sounds like people thought that's what was going on, but I don't believe it myself. Cool. Agree to disagree. This is the internet. I don't need to convince you. You don't need to think what I think. I don't need to think what you think. No hard feelings. I understand that like many people throughout history, not everyone today is going to buy.
All right, what do you think? Like I said, a couple of things that I guess are just little minor tweaks. I agree that the victors do write history. I can't think of one solitary other source that the loser was able to write history. They're not in control. But I think Christians are the winners. It wasn't just the Romans trying to suppress this. It was the Jews as well. I don't believe there's any other instance where you have the outside and the inside fighting as hard as they can to get rid of something and it not being able to get rid of it. The people in power, the people that had the right and the ability to take their lives and were doing it hands down nearly daily, killing Christians, and they couldn't stomp it out. Now, how's that possible? It's not possible unless God was involved with it. One of my strongest arguments is the apostles. If you look at the apostles, nearly all of them, for their day, were very, very successful people. For what the The American dream, Matthew was living the American dream. He was out there getting more money for himself and living for things. He was living the American dream. He just left it. You have Peter and Andrew and John as successful fishermen. They just left their livelihood. And they didn't leave it for any of the things that people leave things for money or for earthly pleasures. They didn't leave it for that. As a matter of fact, they were persecuted, beaten. Unless I don't want to misspeak, but I believe the only one that didn't die a martyr was John. Is that correct? The only one that didn't die for this and never recanted it was John. What reason did they have? I mean, look at Paul. Paul was a well-respected member, had money because he was a Pharisee. That means he had money. He just left it after he'd been killing Christians. Why? Why would you do that if this was not real? I can't come up with no logical reasons for this other than this is divinely done and controlled. That's the only thing that I can come up with from my logical thinking. That's pretty. Unless y'all have questions, that's pretty much all that I have for today. Y'all have any? Does anybody have any questions or any comments they'd like to make?
I have one.
All right, Mike.
King James Bible was written by about 70 different people, and they had a little movie on it somewhere. I don't know where it's at. How they found out most of the stuff, and most of the stuff is in Egypt and in Israel and places like that, in libraries. And this book has not got all the information we need in it, but they found things that could have been put in it, and they could have put all the things in the Bible in order as they were doing it, but they didn't do it. But King James ordered them to write a book because none of them were right. And King James done it. And there's a movie out on it. And I saw the movie, but I didn't see it all the way through. I don't know what the end of it did, but I just know that. And according to this guy, what I feel from him, that he looked into it, but I don't think he's saved.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Okay.
But my opinion is King James did do the Bible, and it took them about 10 years to do it. My feeling, sort of. But this guy, I don't think he's got Jesus in, because he just talked about all the things that were told, and he didn't even go back to the libraries in Egypt and look at some of the stuff that was in the libraries.
Well,
Libraries have
Mike, let's talk about it a little bit when we get done, okay? If you don't mind. I understand. Let's just talk about it here in a minute, if that's all right. I'm sorry, I'm lost now. I do want to say something that you brought up, though, Mike. And he talked about it briefly, but that's another thing that is amazing to me, is that we have these manuscripts still. It wasn't like we had computers or printing presses or anything that we have had to be handwritten, and if you wanted another copy, it had to be handwritten. How many of you have made copies and handwritten huge books? I mean, it was not simple. First of all, you had to make the material to write it on and make the material to write it with. I mean, it wasn't like that. It was, going out and buying a piece of paper was expensive at that particular point in time, because it wasn't easy to come up with this stuff. This was important to people. So like I said, I just cannot. I can't understand why, from just a logical standpoint. I understand that you cannot be saved without God calling you. You just can't. But from even a logical standpoint, I don't know how anybody could argue that this didn't exist.
I so I appreciated the effort that went into producing this, but I also resonated with one of his final comments. He said, "Hey, look, one could conclude many things from all this information, right? One could conclude, I just don't believe he's who he said he was, right?
Right.
I get that, but it's very difficult, seems to me, to look at this evidence from all that many sources and conclude this was fabricated.
Right.
It just wasn't."
Right.
And even the early Jews, the Pharisees, debated about how we did these things,
Right.
and they drew various conclusions about how Jesus sourced the power, but they didn't debate what happened.
Yeah, they didn't debate that it happened. They just where to get the power to do it from. Exactly. Yeah.
You can say, he healed all these people.
Yeah.
Historic fact.
Yes.
That to me is really valuable.
Yes.
In having a solid conversation with an unbeliever.
Well, next week, just to give you a preview, we're going to talk briefly. I'm going to kind of focus on three. I think that all versions of the Bible that we don't use have something in common. All those religions have something in common. Now I'm going to focus on three: Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, and Catholicism. I'm going to mention a couple others, but I want to focus on three and why we believe our version of the Bible and what I think they all have in common next week. But I'm not going to steal that thunder today.
What was that guy's name?
Matt Whitman. Look for him. His deal is the. But you can still find all kinds of stuff by looking up the 10-minute Bible Hour. That's the thing that he was famous for. He had a show called the 10-minute Bible Hour. Matt Whitman is who that was. And I love his stuff from a research standpoint. He talks a lot about. He did a series on the differences in like Protestantism and Catholicism and all kinds of different. He goes into a lot of different churches and just gives you information for what they believe. And for finding that kind of stuff out, I think he's extremely useful. Barry, now, can you hear me, Barry?
Yeah,
Would you close us in prayer?
Heavenly Father, we just thank you, Lord, for your word